Hello and welcome. Now, in this lecture, we're going to create our very first blueprint based on the character class. This is going to be the blueprint that our character is based on. Think of it like we're building a house. Now, the blueprint itself is not the house. It's just the blueprint. It's the game plan. It has all the properties and specifications, and then once we drag an instance of our character into the world, it will then be the house. It will be the actual character that has all of the properties that we've defined in our blueprint. So let's dig in and create our very first blueprint based on the character class. So here's my first-person shooter project, and I'd like to make my first blueprint. Now here in the content browser, I have this content folder, and everything we create in this game will be in the content folder, but we can create new folders to keep things organized. I'm going to right-click on the content folder and select New Folder. Now I have a new folder directly inside the content folder, and we'll place all of our new blueprints in this folder. So I'm going to call this folder Blueprints. Now we can create new folders inside of folders. I can right-click on the blueprint folder here and select New Folder, or with the blueprint folder open, I can right-click here in this gray area and select New Folder. Now this new folder in the Blueprints folder will be called Character. Now I can expose this by expanding the drop-down next to Blueprints and select Character. I can also just double-click the Character folder and enter it here. Now here in the Character folder is where I'd like to create the new character blueprint, and I can do that by right-clicking and selecting Blueprint Class. If I click on this, then I now have the ability to pick a parent class. This has to do with that hierarchy we were just talking about, and next to each class type, we have a short description explaining what that type is capable of. We're going to create a character blueprint, so let's select Character, and now we have a new blueprint in our character folder. Now we're going to call this FPS for first-person shooter underscore character. And we now have a character blueprint. So let's double-click on this to open our blueprint editor and dock this up at the top. Now we have a little viewport here showing us the objects that belong to this character class. Now I can hold the Alt key and left-click and drag around to rotate around this character. But we also have the ability to maneuver around the same way we would in the level viewport. Now in the blueprint editor here, we have some panels over here to the left. We have the Components panel, and we see that the character class already has some components. I mentioned that the character comes with a capsule component by default. You'll see that it's the topmost component here. In parentheses, it says Collision Cylinder. The name of the component is Capsule Component, and we see in parentheses that it's inherited. That's because it already comes with this capsule, and if we wanted to delete this or remove it, we would not be able to, because it's inherited from the C++ code side. All of these blueprints have C++ under the hood. Now we also see that we have an arrow component, and this arrow component is not visible in the game. The only thing it's good for is showing us the forward direction. Look at this gizmo at the bottom left of the viewport. We see that it has X, Y, and Z axes, and these are showing us the local directions for this character class, and that our arrow here is pointing in the positive X direction. In Unreal Engine, we consider the positive X direction the forward direction. Z is, of course, the upward direction, and the Y direction is considered the right direction. Negative Y, of course, being the left direction. Now, you might notice to the right we have a Details panel. The Details panel shows all of the details and properties associated with whatever we have selected. And the arrow component here does not have anything in the Details panel. But the Capsule component, if we select that in the Components tab here, does have lots of properties. For example, under Shape, it has Capsule Half Height and Capsule Radius. And we can click and drag left or right on these numbers to adjust these properties. You'll notice as I adjust the capsule half height, the capsule in the viewport expands, getting taller or shorter. I'm going to use Control-Z to undo those changes. Now I can select the capsule from here in the Components tab or here in the viewport by left-clicking on it. Now the next component inherited by the character class is this mesh component. If I hover over it, we see in parentheses skeletal mesh component. This is a bit more complex than a simple static mesh component. A static mesh, as I mentioned before, does not morph or animate, but a skeletal mesh component does have the ability to morph and animate using animation assets. Now, this skeletal mesh component, called mesh, has a number of properties here in the details panel. One of those properties is called skeletal mesh, and we see that it has a drop-down allowing us to select various skeletal meshes that exist in this project. And we see that there are several that exist in this project. Now, the next inherited component is this one called character movement, and this is a character movement component. And in the details panel, we see a bunch of variables that affect the way that our character can move. So this is just one of those features built into the character class that the pawn class does not have. Now, we've created a new blueprint based on the character class, and I'd like to make the distinction between the default blueprint and an actual instance of this blueprint class in the world. We can add one of these characters to the world by simply clicking on the blueprint and dragging into the world. This FPS character that we just dragged into the world is what's known as an instance of the FPS character blueprint class. This exists independently from what we call the default blueprint, and that's this blueprint that we see when we open the asset in the blueprint editor. Now, this instance of the character that we have in the world has its own details panel. If I click this gray line and drag up, right next to the World Settings tab, there's a tab for the details of this instance of the character. And I can change some of the properties here in the details panel. And there's even a little window showing the components that belong to this class. For example, I can select the skeletal mesh component called mesh, and if I scroll down, I see the skeletal mesh property here. And I can click the dropdown and select any of these skeletal meshes and set the skeletal mesh property to that mesh. Now, I've selected the drone here, so this particular instance of this character blueprint that I created now has its skeletal mesh property on the mesh component set to this drone mesh. But if I go back to the blueprint editor, I see that nothing has changed. That's because this instance that exists in the world is not the same as the default blueprint. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hit the delete key with this character selected. So as a challenge, I'd like you to open the character blueprint class that we just created in the blueprint editor and set its skeletal mesh component, and I'd like you to choose the mesh_arms skeletal mesh asset from the dropdown. And once you're done, go ahead and drag in an instance of this FPS character class into the world. Pause the video and do this now. Okay, so I have the FPS character blueprint open, and I'm going to select the mesh component and set its skeletal mesh. So I'm going to click the drop down here, and I'm going to choose mesh_arms. And now we see that we have these really cool, sort of realistic looking arms. And these are going to be the arms that we use for our character in this game. So now that we have a pair of arms, let's go ahead and compile and save. And back here in the level, I can drag in an instance of our FPS character blueprint, and now one exists in the level. Now, before we wrap up this video, I'm going to go back and talk about this compile button for a second. The word compile comes from C++ programming. In C++, when we program, we're typically writing lines of code in a text editor, and each of those lines of code must be translated into ones and zeros so the machine can read it. Well, in blueprints, what we're doing is essentially the same as writing code, only our code comes in the form of these nodes and wires. But ultimately, that code needs to be translated into ones and zeros for the computer to be able to read it. And the action of translating it into ones and zeros is known as compiling. Every time we change something on this class, we typically compile by hitting the compile button, so those changes will all be compiled into a language the computer can understand before we go and hit play to test things out. So we'll be hitting this compile button quite frequently each time we make changes to our blueprint classes. So in summary, we've created our very first blueprint based on the character class, and we dragged it in and created an instance based on this class, and this is going to be the character that we control as we run around in the level and shoot at things. So this is going to be very fun. We also set the skeletal mesh component on our character, and we chose those arms, and very soon we'll be placing a weapon in those arms. So don't worry about that. We'll get to that very, very soon. In the next lecture, we're going to continue working on this character blueprint. I'll see you soon.